350 years ago, there was a city built on mud, timber, and sheer stubbornness that quietly controlled more ships, more silver, and more secrets than any empire on the map, and almost nobody outside its canals understood how the whole machine actually worked. That city was Amsterdam in the year 1667, and what you are about to walk through is not a museum tour, and it is not a history lecture. It is a living reconstruction, built frame by frame from the paintings, engravings, and maps that the people of that century actually left behind with their own hands. Every canal you're about to see, every rooftop, every face in a crowd, every ship's mast against the sky, all of it is drawn from something real that survived 400 years just so we could bring it back to life today. So stay with me for the next few minutes, because by the time this walk is over, you are going to understand exactly why the entire world once looked at one small, damp, unglamorous patch of land in Northern Europe and called it the richest city on the face of the earth. Let's start where the money always started, on the water. Amsterdam was not built the way most great cities were built. It didn't grow around a hill or a fortress or a river mouth that nature handed to it for free. It was built on a swamp that its own people drained, diked, and reinforced with tens of thousands of wooden piles driven straight down into the mud, one street at a time, one canal, ring at a time. By 1667, that swamp had become the financial capital of the known world, and the canal beside the royal palace was where you could feel that transformation happening in real time. This waterway never really slept. Cargo boats slid past at a slow, deliberate pace, low in the water under the weight of grain, timber, and barrels of preserved fish. Dock hands rolled casks off narrow gangplanks with the kind of practiced ease that only comes from doing something 10,000 times before. Locals picked their way along the stone edges toward the market stalls just a few streets over, stepping around coils of rope and stacks of crates without even looking down. The houses that lined this canal were tall but plain, built for function rather than flattery, their shutters thrown wide open to pull the cool, slightly briny air off the water and up into rooms stacked 3 and 4 stories high. Nothing about this scene was staged for an audience. There was no audience. This was simply a trading city doing, without ceremony, what it did every single morning of every single year, moving goods, moving people, and moving money, quietly, efficiently, and constantly. Follow that same water inland and it spills you out into Dam Square, and if the canals were Amsterdam's bloodstream, this square was its heart. By the late 1660s, this open plaza had become the true center of gravity for the entire city. The one place where every class of person crossed paths whether they wanted to or not. Public notices were read aloud here to crowds who couldn't yet read them for themselves. Farmers rolled in from the surrounding countryside, with carts loaded with vegetables, cheese, and livestock, setting up before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops. Traders haggled over prices in half a dozen languages, because by this point in history, Amsterdam's harbor had made it one of the most genuinely international cities on the continent. Sailors, merchants, and refugees from a dozen different countries all doing business in the same square on the same morning. The building that towered over all of it wasn't yet the royal palace you might picture today. In 1667, it was simply the town hall, and it stood there as a blunt, physical statement of exactly where power lived in this city. Not with a monarch, not with a single noble family, with the merchants, the magistrates, and the guilds who ran the place like an extremely profitable committee. The square itself buzzed constantly, haggling voices rising and falling, cartwheels grinding over uneven stone, dogs weaving between legs, the general hum of a place that genuinely never stopped moving, day after day, year after year. Follow the canals further out, away from the noise of the square, and you find the quieter arteries of the city, the kind of water used less for hauling cargo and more for simply living. Small boats ferried goods from warehouse to doorstep along these routes, while residents walked the narrow paths on their way to work, to worship, or simply to visit family a few streets over. The houses lining these calmer canals were built for efficiency rather than display. Narrow fronts to save on the property tax that was famously calculated by width, tall windows to pull in as much daylight as possible, every single inch of space put to deliberate use. It's tempting now, from 4 centuries away, to romanticize this stretch of water as something picturesque and quaint, At the time, though, it was simply infrastructure. This was Amsterdam's version of an ordinary residential street, except that street happened to be made of water, and everyone who lived here treated it with exactly that much everyday familiarity. Then the canal bends, and the entire mood of the city changes with it. This is the curve of the Herengracht, and by the late 1660s it had become one of the single most expensive stretches of real estate anywhere in Europe. This was where the merchants who had made genuine fortunes overseas, in spices, in textiles, in shipping, in finance, chose to build, and they built to be seen. Broad, symmetrical houses rose along both banks, each one fronted by a carefully composed facade, designed by architects who understood that in this city, your front door was a form of advertising. The water itself grew calmer here, fewer cargo boats, more private ones, gliding past at a leisurely pace, carrying families rather than freight. The paths beside the canal were lined with trimmed gardens and swept brick, maintained by servants whose entire job was to make sure nothing here ever looked anything less than immaculate. This was wealth putting itself on permanent, deliberate display, carved into stone and brick, so that it would still be standing centuries later, which, of course, it is. A few streets away from that quiet display of money stood a building that looked far less impressive from the outside, but was arguably more powerful than anything on the Herengracht. This was the Oost-Indisch Huis, the headquarters of the Dutch East India Company, a private trading corporation that, by 1667, had its own army, its own navy, its own courts, and the legal authority to wage war on its own initiative on the other side of the planet. Inside these walls, administrators plotted voyages that would send ships around the southern tip of Africa, across the Indian Ocean, and into ports that most people in this square would never see with their own eyes. The courtyard outside stayed busy with clerks hauling ledgers, sailors reporting for assignment, and porters carrying cargo samples between meetings that would decide the fate of entire shipments before they'd even left the harbor. It wasn't loud the way the docks were loud. It didn't need to be. This was where decisions were made quietly, in ink, at a desk, that would later be carried out thousands of miles away in wood, salt, and human lives. It is genuinely difficult to overstate how much of the modern world, from stock exchanges to multinational corporations, to the very concept of a publicly traded company, traces its blueprint back to the paperwork that moved through this exact courtyard. Not far from the same corner of the city stood the home of the De Pinto family, Portuguese Jewish merchants whose success in trade had made their house one of the most striking on the entire street. This detail matters more than it might seem at first glance. Amsterdam in this century had no walled-off quarter, forcing any particular community into any particular neighborhood, an arrangement that was strikingly unusual for the era. If a family could afford an address, they could live there, regardless of where they had come from or what they believed. Walking past the De Pinto house in 1667, you would have seen exactly what that unusual freedom looked like in ordinary, everyday practice. A well-built, well-kept home, standing not as a monument to tolerance, but simply as an unremarkable fact of daily life. That, in its own quiet way, was the point. The most powerful proof of a city's openness isn't a grand gesture. It's a house on a normal street that nobody thought twice about. Crossing back toward the river, we reached the Blaubrug as it stood in 1667, a modest wooden bridge named for its pale blue railings, spanning the wide, working current of the Amstel. Beneath it, cargo boats, fishing vessels, and passenger barges moved along in a steady, unhurried rhythm, while warehouses and workshops lined both riverbanks. Their doors open to the water, so goods could move straight from boat to storeroom, without ever touching dry land. Pedestrians crossed constantly, cutting between neighborhoods on business that ranged from the mundane to the enormous. A fisherman heading home, a merchant chasing down a shipment, a courier carrying a letter that might contain instructions for a voyage worth a small fortune. It wasn't a grand landmark by any stretch of the imagination. It was simply where the city crossed itself, over and over, thousands of times a day, without anyone stopping to notice. Nearby stands the Amsterdam Town Hall as it appeared closer to the end of the century, by that point already regarded as one of the great architectural achievements of the age, a building so admired that visitors from across Europe made a point of coming to see it with their own eyes. Citizens moved through the square in front of it constantly, coming to settle legal disputes, register contracts, pay their taxes, or simply attend to the kind of civic business that keeps a city functioning behind the scenes. The building's clean, balanced facade was never an accident. It was meant to say one thing clearly to citizen and foreign visitor alike. This city is stable, this city is wealthy, and this city intends to remain both for a very long time. Further along the Herengracht, near the old Haarlemmer Sluis, the canal takes on a calmer character once again. Tall, evenly spaced merchant homes with wide windows and understated decoration, built by families who had already made their fortune and simply wanted somewhere pleasant and dignified to enjoy it. Foot traffic here moved slower than almost anywhere else in the city. Boats drifted past rather than rushed. Conversations lingered on doorsteps instead of being shouted across a crowded square. This was a street built for people who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, and it shows, even now, in every surviving image of it. And then there is the Oudeschans, marked by the unmistakable silhouette of the Montelbaan-Storen, one of the most recognizable landmarks for anyone arriving in the city by water. This tower did double duty as both a watchpoint over the harbor approach and a navigational marker for incoming ships. And its bell helped regulate the rhythm of the entire surrounding neighborhood, marking hours the way a church bell might elsewhere. Along its banks sat modest houses and workshops, beside residents hauling goods, drawing water, or simply going about the unremarkable business of an ordinary day. It's easy to focus only on the grand houses and the great trading companies when picturing a golden age, but scenes like this one, quiet, practical, slightly worn at the edges, were the actual texture of most people's daily lives in this city, far more than any palace or company headquarters ever was. Before the harbor, though, there's a building that deserves its own moment, because in many ways it was the real control room of the entire economy. The Amsterdam Bourse. This was, by 1667, widely considered the world's first true stock exchange, a covered courtyard where merchants gathered at set hours every single day to trade shares, futures, and commodities with a formality that would look surprisingly familiar to anyone who's ever watched a modern trading floor. Grain prices, spice shipments, shares in the East India Company itself. All of it changed hands here, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in shouted bids that could move a fortune in a matter of seconds. Merchants stood in loose clusters organized by the specific goods they dealt in, so a man looking to buy pepper knew exactly which corner of the courtyard to walk toward. Rumors about a delayed fleet or a lost ship could ripple through this room and change a family's fortune before the news had even been confirmed. It was loud, it was tense, and it ran almost entirely on trust, reputation, and the assumption that a man's word, once given here, was as binding as anything written on paper. Step outside the Bourse and into an ordinary market day, and you'd find a very different but equally essential side of the city's economy, the markets that fed it. The fish market ran early, loud and unglamorous, with catches hauled straight off boats still glistening from the harbor, sold by vendors who knew every regular customer by name. The butter and cheese markets ran with a quieter, more methodical rhythm, farmers from the surrounding countryside laying out enormous wheels and blocks for inspection by buyers who tapped, sniffed, and tasted before a single coin changed hands. Women ran a striking share of this daily commerce, managing stalls, negotiating prices, and keeping the books for family businesses in a way that gave them a genuine, if often unofficial, foothold in the city's economic life. None of this made the headlines of the age. It didn't need to. It was simply the daily machinery that kept every household in the city fed, while the larger fortunes were being made a few streets away. And then there was winter, which turned this entire city into something almost unrecognizable. When the canals froze solid enough to bear weight, the same waterways that carried cargo boats all summer became the city's playground, and its shortcut all at once. Skaters glided along frozen stretches of water that had been choked with barges just weeks earlier, cutting between neighborhoods faster on ice than any cart could manage on the streets above. Vendors set up braziers right on the frozen canal to sell warm food and drink to skaters passing by, turning a stretch of ice into a temporary open-air market. It's one of the most striking contrasts of the entire era. The same infrastructure that made this city one of the wealthiest trading powers on Earth, also, for a few months each year, became the setting for something closer to a citywide festival with merchants' children and dock workers' children. skating past each other on the very same frozen water. Not every corner of the city carried the same air of quiet dignity as the Herengracht, either, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Near the docks, in the streets closest to the harbor, taverns stayed loud and lit long after the rest of the city had gone dark, filled with sailors freshly paid off from a voyage and in a hurry to spend it. This was where stories from the far side of the world got told and exaggerated in equal measure, where a returning crewman might describe a port in the Indies to a room full of people who would never travel further than the edge of the province themselves. It was rougher here, and louder, and considerably less concerned with the careful facades a few canals over. But it was every bit as much a part of what made this city work, because without these sailors, and without these taverns willing to take their money the moment they stepped off the gangplank, none of the wealth on display elsewhere in the city would have had ships to sail on in the first place. Finally, after all of that, we arrive at the harbor itself, the true engine behind absolutely everything you've just walked through. In the 1660s, this was one of the busiest maritime hubs anywhere on the entire continent, a forest of masts stretching out along the waterfront as far as the eye could follow. Massive ships belonging to the Dutch East India Company were loaded and readied here for voyages that could last a year or more, carrying crews who knew, statistically, that a meaningful number of them would never make it home again. Smaller boats ferried goods constantly between ship and warehouse, and dock workers moved without pause from dawn until well after dark, hauling cargo on and off the docks in a rhythm that never fully stopped because the moment one ship was unloaded, another was already waiting to take its place. The air here was never quiet. Rigging creaked under its own weight. Carts rattled endlessly over uneven stone. Crews shouted instructions across the water in overlapping languages, and somewhere underneath all of it sat the low, constant slap of water against hulls. Almost everything you saw on this walk, the mansions on the Herengracht, the confident stone of the town hall, the quiet dignity of the Haarlemmer sluies, was paid for, directly or indirectly, right here at the edge of this harbor by ships that most of the city would only ever see leave, and, if things went well, return. Before we step back, there's one more layer of this city worth walking through, because the money and the ships only tell half the story. Amsterdam in 1667 wasn't just a port. It was, quietly, one of the great information capitals of the world. Printing houses across the city turned out books, maps, and pamphlets at a pace almost no other European city could match, partly because censorship here was far looser than in most of the surrounding kingdoms. Ideas that could get a man imprisoned in Paris or Madrid could be typeset, printed, and sold openly a few streets from Dam Square, and that freedom pulled in scholars, refugees, and thinkers who wanted to publish something the rest of Europe wouldn't allow. Walking past one of these print shops, you'd have heard the rhythmic clack of the press itself, smelled the sharp scent of fresh ink drying on paper, and seen apprentices sorting through trays of metal type by hand, letter by letter, for books that might end up on shelves as far away as London or Lisbon. In a city built on trade, information had simply become another commodity worth exporting. The same openness that let printers publish freely also shaped the artists working in the city at this exact moment. This was, after all, the era when painters here were producing some of the most closely observed portraits and street scenes in European history. Not grand mythological works commissioned by kings, but paintings of merchants, markets, kitchens, and canals made for a wealthy trading class that wanted to see its own city reflected back at itself. That's precisely why a reconstruction like this one is even possible 400 years later. The people of this city, for reasons of pride, vanity, and genuine curiosity about their own surroundings, documented themselves obsessively. Their houses, their harbor, their faces, their weather. Most cities from this period survive only in the words of a handful of chroniclers. Amsterdam survives in thousands of images, which is exactly what makes it possible to walk through it visually, canal by canal, the way we've just done. None of this prosperity came without risk, and it's worth being honest about that too. A city this densely built, this dependent on wooden ships, wooden houses, and crowded wooden docks, lived permanently one spark away from disaster, and fire regulations were taken with a seriousness that bordered on obsession. Guilds enforced strict rules about how chimneys were built and maintained. Night watchmen patrolled the narrower streets, specifically listening for the crackle of flame rather than the sound of crime. Disease was an even greater threat than fire, and outbreaks moved fast and mercilessly through neighborhoods packed this tightly together, regardless of how much money sat behind a merchant's front door. The wealth on display along the Herengracht didn't buy immunity from any of that. It bought slightly better odds, better doctors, and a slightly larger house to quarantine yourself inside of, and that was about the extent of it. And running underneath all of this, the ships, the presses, the paintings, the fear of fire and plague, was the guild system, the quiet machinery that actually decided who got to do what in this city. Nearly every trade had one: bakers, brewers, silversmiths, ship carpenters, even the painters themselves. Guilds set prices, trained apprentices over years of unpaid labor before granting them the right to practice independently, and settled disputes long before anyone thought to involve a magistrate. It wasn't romantic. It was often rigid, exclusive, and slow to change. But it was also what gave this city its remarkable consistency of craftsmanship, generation after generation. And it's a large part of why a house built on the Herengracht in the 1660s could still be standing, largely unchanged, hundreds of years later. Stand back from all of it for a moment, and the whole picture starts to make sense. Amsterdam in 1667 wasn't wealthy because of one lucky break, or one clever ruler, or one stroke of geographic fortune. It was wealthy because an ordinary, unglamorous, waterlogged patch of land had organized itself, brick by brick and canal by canal, around trade, tolerance, and sheer relentless practicality, and then kept doing that without pause for the better part of a century. There was no single palace at the center of this story, because the story was never really about a monarch. It was about merchants, sailors, clerks, dock workers, and families of every background who happened to be building the modern financial world, one ledger entry at a time, without ever fully realizing that's what they were doing. What's easy to miss, looking back from 4 centuries later, is how ordinary all of it felt to the people actually living it. Nobody walking across Dam Square on a Tuesday morning thought of themselves as standing inside a golden age. They were thinking about the price of grain, or a shipment that was 2 weeks overdue, or whether the frost would hold long enough for one more skate across the canal before dinner. That's the strange trick of history. The moments we now call extraordinary were, to the people inside them, simply Tuesday. And it's exactly that ordinariness, preserved so carefully in paint and ink by people who had no idea we'd ever be watching, that makes this city worth walking through again. 400 years later, one canal at a time. That's Amsterdam in 1667, not a fairy tale, not a postcard, and not the version you'll find carved into a souvenir. It was a working city at the peak of one of the most extraordinary economic stretches in human history, built by people who mostly never thought of themselves as living through a golden age at all. They were simply loading ships, haggling in a square, and drawing water from a canal, one ordinary morning after another. If you want to see another century, another harbor, another city brought back to life the exact same way, tell me which one, and we'll walk through it together next.